Have you ever found yourself doing the exact same thing you swore you never do again? Or maybe you've watched a friend do it. It's one of the most maddening parts of being human. We know something is bad for us, we know it's destructive, but we do it anyway. Well, today we're going to dive into a theological framework that tries to make sense of this exact problem, this paradox of the human will.
Right. So why do we do it? Why are we like that moth drawn to a flame? We can see the fire, we know it's going to burn us, and yet, there we go, flying right back in. This goes way deeper than just breaking a bad habit. It really gets to the core of who we are. Questions about choice, about freedom, and about responsibility. And you know, what makes this so tricky is that the Bible itself seems to hold this massive tension. On the one hand, you get these direct commands, like this one from Joshua. Choose you this day. The responsibility is put right on our shoulders. But then, in other places, the Bible talks about humanity as being, well, slaves to sin. So what is it? Are we free to choose, or are we captives who can't help ourselves?
All right, so to really get our heads around this, here's the roadmap. We're going to start with that moth to a flame paradox. Then we'll look at a historical breakdown of the will that makes a really crucial distinction. After that, we'll explore how God's plan and our human choices can actually work together. Then we'll see how grace fits in as the solution. And finally, we'll ask, why does any of this actually matter in real life?
Okay, so let's jump into that central problem. How can we be told to choose and be held responsible for our choices if at the same time we're described as being trapped, unable to do what's right? It really feels like a contradiction. So the school of thought we're digging into today, which is often called Reformed theology, it tackles this paradox by starting somewhere you might not expect. It doesn't actually begin with us and our free will. It begins with God and His role in everything. The whole foundation here is this idea that God is the first cause. This isn't the idea that God is just some spectator up in the stands just watching the game unfold. No, this view, which comes from passages like Ephesians 1:11, says that God is actively and wisely ordaining everything that happens. And this is the absolute key, it claims He does this without making anyone sin and without violating our will. So how in the world is that possible? Well, to understand the human side of the equation, this framework gives us a kind of historical roadmap. The question, do we have free will, gets answered with another question. Okay, but which version of humanity are you talking about? So check out this timeline. It shows 4 different states for the human will. It all starts in a state of innocence, back before the fall, where people were able to sin, but they were also able not to sin. But after the fall, everything changed, and humanity was plunged into a state of sin. From there, for believers, you enter a state of grace, which eventually leads to a final state of glory. The big takeaway here is that the will's abilities are totally different in each of these stages. Now, let's zoom in on that second state, the state of sin, because this is considered our default setting after the fall. The Latin phrase here, non posse non peccare, literally means not able not to sin. Now, this doesn't mean that everyone is as evil as they could possibly be all the time, not at all. The idea is that our fundamental nature, our heart, is corrupted, and our will is essentially a servant to that heart. It's in bondage to those corrupt desires. And that brings us to what is, without a doubt, the most important distinction in this entire way of thinking. It's the difference between what's called natural liberty and moral bondage. Okay, this is the whole ballgame right here. We absolutely have what's called natural liberty. We are not puppets on a string. We make real choices all day long based on what we want. But, and here's the twist, we are in moral bondage. That means our wanter itself is broken. Our desires are corrupt. So while we are totally free to choose what we want, we're just not able to want what is truly good and righteous in God's eyes.
This verse from John's Gospel is a classic text for this view. Jesus says no man can come. The problem isn't that God put up a big no trespassing sign. The problem is an inability inside of us. We lack both the power and, more importantly, the desire to come to Him on our own.
Okay, so if God is sovereign over everything, and humans are real, responsible agents making choices, how do those two things not just crash into each other? Well, this brings us to a concept called compatibilism. So compatibilism is a bit of a mouthful, but the idea is actually pretty straightforward. It's the view that God's sovereignty as the primary cause is perfectly compatible with our real choices as the secondary cause. In fact, it goes further and says that God actually accomplishes His sovereign plan through our free actions.
Let's look at a famous story from the Bible to see what this looks like in practice.
All right, here's the story of Joseph. His brothers, out of pure jealousy, sell him into slavery. It's a terrible act. But years later, Joseph is basically running Egypt, and he finally confronts them. And in this one sentence, he explains the whole idea of compatibilism perfectly.
Let's break it down. You've got two different causes at work in the exact same event. First, the human cause. Joseph's brothers acted freely from their own sinful hearts. They are 100% responsible. Ye thought evil. But at the exact same time, there was a divine cause. God was working in that very same evil act for his own good and redemptive purpose. God meant it unto good. See? Two causes, one event. And in this view, zero contradiction. So, if the will is in moral bondage, totally unable to choose God, what's the solution? How does anyone ever get out of that moth-to-the-flame cycle? The answer, in this system, is one powerful word: grace.
This promise from the prophet Ezekiel is absolutely central to the whole idea. The solution to a will that's stuck following a corrupt heart isn't to force the will against its desires. It's to change the heart itself. You could call it a kind of divine spiritual surgery.
The problem is what the Bible calls a stony heart. It's hard, it's cold, it's hostile towards God. The solution that grace provides is a divine transplant. God gives a heart of flesh, one that has a totally new nature with brand new desires, a nature that now actually wants God. So here's the bottom line on the solution. Grace doesn't drag someone kicking and screaming against their will. It changes their heart so that they willingly, freely, and even joyfully choose what they couldn't stand before. So in this way of thinking, grace doesn't violate the will, it actually liberates it from its slavery to sin. Okay, that is a lot of theology, I know. But so what? Why does this complex system actually matter in day-to-day life? What's the intended outcome for a person who actually believes all this? Well, the sources point to some very practical results. First off, it's meant to absolutely kill pride. I mean, if your salvation is a 100% gift from start to finish, you have zero room to boast. Second, it's meant to deepen empathy. Instead of looking at people stuck in destructive patterns and thinking they're just idiots, you start to see them as captives who need to be set free. And finally, it's meant to strengthen your commitment to truth. Because if you believe only God can change a heart, you stop relying on your own clever tricks or manipulation and start relying on his power.
And ultimately, this whole idea brings us right back around to freedom. But it completely redefines it. True freedom, in this view, isn't the ability to do anything you want. It's being set free by Christ to finally want and to choose what is truly and eternally good. And that leaves us with one last thing to think about. Whether you agree with any of this or not, how does taking the time to understand the internal logic, the why, behind someone else's deeply held belief change the way we see and interact with that person? It's a question worth chewing on. Thanks for joining us for this explainer.